I'd rather create something that others criticise than create nothing and criticise others.
If you have high quality product behind the bar, it's like weapon.
It's not about the figures. It's about who those figures are.
The Hospopreneurs Podcast.
I'm going to drink this beer.
Yeah, let's crack them.
With James Henderson. Hello and welcome to episode 47 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Starward Whiskey invited me down to Melbourne for the release of their new whiskey, Twofold, a dual malt and wheat drop. The following morning, I sat down with David Vitale, who shared some of the most valuable insights we've heard on the show and a rare tipple from his office. Starward are truly innovating and paving the way for the Australian spirit category, so I'm incredibly grateful to have had this episode with these guys. I hope you enjoy listening. Hello and welcome to the show, David.
Thank you very much for interviewing us. It was a great night last night, obviously, at the event, so really good to kind of back it up this morning with some more time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me along, and we've enjoyed a beautiful espresso this morning to wake back up and fire into the day. Today we're in the Starward Distillery in Port Melbourne, and thank you for hosting us here as well. I'm looking forward to interviewing you today. As you know, the first question I like to ask is, what's your crazy hospitality story, David?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's not zany crazy, but it's just kind of like a crazy moment in terms of like, well, of course, when you kind of look back on it. I was actually trying to impress a former girlfriend of mine, this is a long time ago, with buying some champagne at the beginning of a dinner. And it was like a fine dining restaurant, and I kind of said, well, what's the difference between the $33 a glass champagne and the $50 a glass champagne? You know, I'm curious to understand. And in a very dry French response, it was like, Monsieur, the occasion. And that was basically it. And so for me, that was really interesting because it's like, well, actually, once you get to that level, you know, quality is kind of foregone, and it really is about the moment.
Wow, I really like that. That's a great response.
Yeah.
I've never heard an answer like that yet. That's great. Thank you very much for your crazy hospitality story. David, I like to ask next, why you do what you do. So this is super big picture. This is really about what inspires you.
Yeah, look, I think I have a very high threshold for risk, you know, a tolerance threshold for risk. In ways that, for example, you know, you have marathon runners that can kind of push through that pain barrier at the 30-kilometre mark and keep going. For me, you know, I'd be terrible at doing that, but can tolerate high degrees of uncertainty and risk. And I'm also kind of driven by the long game. You know, I think if I weren't in whiskey, I'd probably be a landscape gardener. You know, designing parks that, you know, you'll see in 30 or 40 years' time.
Yes.
So I'm always sort of thinking the longer picture. And for me, I guess the reason why we started Starward, my wife and I started to think about whiskey, you know, was that it was really evident that we were able to make great whiskey in Australia. Like that had been done for years. You know, but for me, it was, why don't we kind of modernise it and contemporize it and make it something that's relevant to people like us?
Yes.
You know? There are huge barriers. There are huge barriers to kind of establishing a distillery. The first of which is time. Like you need to kind of wait while the whiskey matures. The second is you've got huge, very well established brands, you know, the 40-ton gorillas of the industry that really don't give you any kind of slack to find an opportunity to sell. And, you know, at that point in time, most whiskey was consumed by our grandparents and, you know, older parents, not a younger generation. So I think it was this idea that it needed to be done, that we had proven that quality, you know, that quality gate was something that we could kind of walk through, like it was an easy kind of gate to get through.
Yes.
And really the challenge then boiled down to how are we going to kind of fund this, and what is it that's going to give us permission to be on the bar as an interesting whiskey when there are so many ones there already.
Yes. And what is it that really inspires you behind the cause that you're building?
I think it's really, quite simply put, it's about capturing the essence of the place it's made in a bottle. It's obviously in the context of flavour, but really trying to capture the essence of the place it's made in a bottle. That's kind of the ambition, and that's really exciting. You know, it's in a way that, you know, if you've come from a tech background or a finance background, it's either intellectual property or there's a strategy or an audience. This is a product that, you know, reflects a place, and so that's the thing that really connects me to whiskies spelled both ways, you know, from anywhere around the world, is that the great ones do that really, really well. And I felt compelled to kind of do the same with Starward.
It's interesting that you describe it like that too, because obviously something that Starward does differently is use wine in your process, and terroir being one of the words that people associate with wine. It's interesting that that's the description that you have as to your why behind what you do. Is that really something that's influenced the wine into your process?
Yeah, it has. I think so. Yeah, the wine barrels that we use to mature the whiskies typically are a day's drive away from the distillery, and that's actually quite unique in the world of whiskey. So bourbons are brand new American oak barrels, and in Scotland, you've got to travel hundreds of kilometres to France, Portugal, Spain, and even Kentucky. They use ex-bourbon barrels to mature their whiskies. So the thing that excited me was, like, I had this light bulb moment of like, well, hold on. Actually, if we do this well, we could be more Australian than Scotch is Scottish. You know, and that's you know, don't say that in Glasgow, like, you know, but that's a great thing to call out, like, you know, and there's a huge opportunity for me, for us to kind of celebrate that provenance and place that whiskies does so well, but not just in marketing terms, but really with flavour that you can taste, smell, and feel when you drink. So it was all about flavour, you know, and looking to the benefits we have within Australia, to try and be a modern Australianism, not a Scotch whisky down under.
Yes. And even the Australian description of whiskey is incredibly broad.
Yes.
How has that influenced your ability to make whiskey?
Yeah, look, I think you know, one of the things that I really celebrate and protect really quite dearly is this idea that our whiskey definition in law is 2 lines long. It's a fermented grey mash that's distilled and then spends a minimum of 2 years in wood. That's it. You know, you can shoot a cannon through that definition by comparison to, say, the Scotch whisky regulations, which are, you know, chapter and verse, 4 volumes long. You know, like they're just, you know, quite intense and very specific. The thing that means is that we're able to innovate. And that's at the heart of most Australian iconic brands. Forgetting about whether it's in booze or anything else, it's like we have the opportunity to do things others don't because of our approach, our attitude, our geography, you know, the advantages that we have. So it was really important for me to kind of celebrate that and say, well, we've been given permission to innovate, and it's almost like we have an obligation to, because other categories can't.
Yes.
And if we want to serve the drinker something that's interesting, the best thing we can do is not be what's already on the shelf. So it was kind of like a meeting of stars in a way. Like they kind of aligned and gave us the opportunity to do what felt right for me to do, given all the wine barrels and the climate that we have in Melbourne, to mature whiskey. I felt really excited about that opportunity, and the regulations were giving me permission to do it, so that was really exciting.
Why do you believe the Australian definition is so broad?
Well, it's very old. It dates back to 1901. And so I think at that point in time, that's all it needed to be. It's an elegantly simple definition. And you've got to think that back then, wooden containers were what we used to transport things. right? That was kind of we didn't have cardboard. So describing a liquid in wood was almost default to be oak anyway, because people knew that was going to be the most effective means by which to cart things. But also, over and above that, I mean, there are a lot of blackwood barrels that are used just to store ports, sherries, wines, and whiskies, but they don't impart any flavour or effectively mature. They're just like a storage vessel. So wood was just the thing that you held it in to make it smoother back then.
Being someone who's innovating in particularly in whiskey, how do you feel about these other innovators who are doing things like aging spirits super quickly?
Yeah.
Or what's your position on things like that?
I'm, as much as I'm a bleeding heart lefty, on social issues, I think, in this environment, I'm like, I couldn't be more like capitalist in nature. To my mind, let the consumer decide. Don't misrepresent what you're doing. I think that's really important. Call it out for what it is. So my view is provided it's transparent, provided you're not trading off the values of other people's process, then I think that there's, it's a broad church, right? There is a minimum age gate of 2 years in Australia, which kind of means that if you want to call it a whiskey, it needs to be 2 years in a day. And if you can make a whiskey that's 2 years in a day old and it tastes great, well, who am I to say it needs more time? And if it's under 2 years of age, don't pass it off as a whiskey, but it might be an interesting drink. And by all means, I'm as curious as the next person.
Because there's been a bit of debate on the show between different guests around whiskey and aging spirits quickly. I've had a few guests on who age spirits quickly, from gin to whiskey to rum. There's all sorts of innovative techniques, and that's something that I really try to uncover, because a lot of people don't understand these super innovative ways to do things, especially the consumer from an outside listening in on the show. So I try to really understand those sorts of things.
So we've always called out our age, and we put a little twist on it, 3 Melbourne years, right? Because that was my way of saying, well, it is young, but relative to a Scotch whisky that might be 15, 18, 20 years. But it probes the person to think, well, what do you mean by a Melbourne year? And then invites that conversation about, well, if you've visited Melbourne, we're famous for our 4 seasons in a day, and that's going to mean that we're going to have a different environment to mature our whiskey in. So 3 Melbourne years is ready. And so we leave it at that. I don't then go on to say, and that means it's like a 20-year-old Scotch whisky, because it's not. 20 years of age is 20 years of age. Age is just that. It's a statement of age. It really doesn't have anything to do with maturity, depending on where you mature in the world. So that was the plan from day one. Fortunately for us, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's been a huge global shortage of age statement whiskies. So a lot of these larger brands that used to talk about age mattering, like that was a campaign, age matters, all of a sudden changed their mind and said, well, age doesn't matter anymore. Here's a non-age statement whiskey. It's still delivering on the values and on the promise of the product. So effectively, there's a bit of an own goal there, and that played perfectly into our core, because it meant that we could say, well, it doesn't matter. We've said that all along, and by the way, that's really interesting, because how old is it now, right? If it's not 12, I'm happy to call it 3.
Yeah.
And it passes a quality gate that we're really happy with.
Yes.
And don't need any more time. How old is yours? And it's sort of like turned the tables around a little bit. So that's been an interesting kind of journey to observe and see. But it's about transparency. I think at the end of the day, whatever you do, it's about transparency.
Well, I love that disruption. It happens across all industries, especially with technology, across so many industries, even in podcasting, for example, with radio. We've got disruption of newspaper with blogs and film with Netflix and YouTube, and there's all sorts of these amazing and interesting things that are happening in our industry.
Yeah, and I think that the point to all of those examples, and Starward's no different in terms of a modern Australian whiskey, is that they're not just a better version of what exists. There is genuine disruption and innovation in what they're doing. So it's redefining the experience. You know, that's kind of, I think, integral to anything that you want to disrupt with. It's not just enough to kind of go on that evolutionary process. It needs to have some element of revolution to it.
And not just redefining whiskey, but defining Australian whiskey.
Yeah.
That's something that you guys are doing.
We have a view that, you know, we've just entered our fourth kind of era of Australian whiskey with the launch of our whiskey last night. And one of the things that I've been really proud of is the fact that actually we've been making great whiskey for, you know, over 100 years, more, 150 years doing. Legitimately. I'm sure there was a illicit still service since the someone sort of like that had some copper and a campfire, but you know, in a legitimate fashion. And there's a very good reason why we love our whiskey in this country. And during the 50s, 60s and 70s, we were drinking pretty much exclusively a domestic product. And so that's quite inspiring. You know, gives us, it gave me confidence that, well, if we did it back then at scale, why can't we do it now at scale? The idea behind Starward was really born of this concept of making Australian whiskey affordable and accessible, right? And when I say accessible, both in terms of availability, but flavour as well. Like, so, you know, it needed to be distinctive as the peatiest of whiskies is to Scotland and Islay, but in an Australian way, and I think that wine barrel kind of influence delivers that, but be approachable in terms of flavour profile and available and accessible and you know, at a sharp price point. So, you know, for us, that to my mind defines a category, is that you've got it available, that you know what it stands for, it's consistently available, and it's something that talks to the place it's made. As I said earlier, one of those things is, you know, using those red wine barrels instantly means as much as you can put your nose to a peated whiskey and say, well, that's Scotch whiskey from the more than, you know, that has been peated. I wanted to be able to put our nose to Starward and say, well, that's delivering on the promise of an Australian whiskey because it's using those wine barrels that just, you know, have an aroma of fruits that is very, very different to other whiskies from around the world.
Amazing. I wonder, and I'm excited to see what the future of Australian whiskey looks like as well.
Me too, and you know, the thing, coming back to our first comment, like, it's a long game, right? So we're doing this for a 20, 30, 40 year kind of journey that will one day hopefully be able to look back upon and say, yeah, we had a meaningful role in defining the category, and regardless of whether we're around or not, you know, like, I mean, I hope we are, but like, I think that there'll be, you know, we will inspire others to come along and follow our lead, you know, mature their whiskey in wine barrels so that we can kind of then start to call out the category for a flavour profile.
On that first comment you made about the long game, it's interesting hearing someone with a healthy risk appetite thinking about the long term. Normally people who like to take risks are very hedonistic and they just want short term results. They're very myopic, right? But it's interesting hearing that you think about the long term. What is it in your background or your maybe not necessarily upbringing, but in your experience that's led you to think like that?
I genuinely don't know, but I'm really grateful for it. I've thought about this a lot, actually, because it is such an interesting character trait that is not the norm, right? Like you said, appetite for risk. We've all got varying degrees of appetites for risk, but typically it's highly correlated to time, right? You know, or inversely correlated. Like the higher the risk, the shorter time frame that you're willing to be exposed to.
Shorter patience.
I think it's just the way my brain is wired, and it's a considered and thoughtful decision process that I go through. I think it's age helps, right? Like, I started this when I was a lot younger and could kind of afford to go, well, what's the worst that could happen? So that was a big support. You know, my wife, you know, is a huge inspiration and support for me in terms of being able to make those big decisions. I think it just comes also from not having a fear of failure. You know, like that idea that what is absolutely the worst that can happen? Today I have my health, I have a beautiful wife and 3 gorgeous kids, they're the most important things in my life. So this is all bonus, and so from that point of view, it then gives you the ability to kind of dream big, take those big steps. Sure, there's sacrifices, along the way, but name me any entrepreneur that hasn't have to give up something to kind of pursue the thing that they're passionate about.
That was a fantastic answer. Thank you, David.
Yeah, cheers.
I'd like to know what you're learning about or exploring at the moment. What is it that you're reading? What content are you absorbing?
So I'm a huge student of business, I think is probably the best way to describe it. So I've always got my head in an entrepreneur's memoir or biography, always thinking about looking at other categories, particularly in tech, and thinking about how that might, because that's where disruption and innovation lives, I guess, mostly. And then kind of thinking about how we can apply some of that thinking to the way we build our brand and what we do.
Yes.
I am absolutely fascinated by the United States. I think, again, coming back to that appetite for risk and lack of, failure is not a bad thing.
Yes.
It just happens sometimes, right? That mindset just is something that I'm always curious about. And, in the new year, I'll be moving the family to the United States to continue to build the brand over in the US. And frankly, I can't wait, because I think that culturally, in as much as there's lots of things that you can all shake our head about, put our hands in our palms in our faces and think what's going on. On the other side, it is an amazing place. Once Churchill, I think, had a great quote. Americans always end up doing the right thing after they've exhausted all other options. And I think that there's the ability for them to mobilize and do stuff with, because of the scale and zeal that they kind of undertake once they've made up a mind, good, bad, or indifferent. It's almost frightening, in terms of how big it is.
Yes. I've got 2 points on that, 2 threads I'd like to follow there.
Sure.
One is just to comment on American culture. I totally agree. It's incredible there. Instead of asking why, like in Australia, they ask why not.
Yeah.
I think that's that difference, is people are incredibly supportive over there about other entrepreneurs and taking that risk, and that's what I find really resonates with me personally as well.
Yeah.
Sort of leads into the other thing I wanted to mention there around entrepreneurial concepts, and obviously being the Hospopreneurs podcast, we talk a lot about entrepreneurship and these ideas particularly from tech and marketing and business, and bring them into hospitality, because it's such a fantastic industry or this sort of collision of all these industries to really build something in hospitality. And it's great to hear your answer.
Yeah, and look, I think and the funny thing is that I've probably heard of the Impossible Burger, right? A meat alternative burger. Where is it established? So this is in the food industry, but it's out of Silicon Valley, right? And so there's an amazing kind of culture there that tech doesn't necessarily have to mean zeros and ones on a computer drive.
That's right.
It's pervasive. While I was in the e-learning business, I spent 6 months in the US, in California, in Northern California, in San Francisco, studying at UC Berkeley, and just having, being in the proximity of all of that kind of high-tech startup environments is an inspiring thing, and it probably juiced me up in a way to kind of take this big leap.
Oh, and it comes back to that first comment on American culture being so powerful, so powerful that why not?
Why not?
I love that.
Exactly.
Tell us more about what you're doing to innovate through all that learning, particularly about entrepreneurship, and the well is infinitely deep, right?
Yeah, so I think there's probably three different phases of innovation. So the first is obviously in the production of the whiskey that we make, right? So that whole idea of using brewing barley instead of distilling barley to drive more flavour into the whiskey. Maturing it in wine barrels in Melbourne, which has got a highly reactive climate, So that's kind of the first area that we've innovated. The second then is early on how we funded the distillery. It's got to scale, because one of the things that, if you want to be an approachable, affordable whiskey, you need to make a lot to get the price down, and make a lot because you need it to kind of serve the market. We funded it through, rather than the typical kind of saving your way to riches, we raised capital very, very early. And at the time that we did that, that was quite a novel thing to do. And even since then, have partnered with Distill Ventures, which is the Diageo program that funds high growth, founder-led distilleries around the world,
Awesome.
or booze brands around the world, to kind of take them to that next level. So I think that there's something in that, because not everybody thinks that way, right? Like a lot of distilleries, particularly historical ones, have been family owned. There's a generational mindset. People feel like control and ownership are the same thing, and they're not. I think that there was a bit of, I have to acknowledge, I guess, that there was that was innovative in and of itself, to kind of think of the business growth and how we're going to fund the distillery differently, how we're going to get to scale quickly. And the third thing is, okay, we've got a product, it tastes great, we've got lots of it. Now, how are we going to sell it? And that, I think, is probably the third phase of innovation with Starward. So we're a modern Australian whiskey, right? We call that out. There's no scrolly fonts on the label. There's no kind of feeling that this label is 100 years old, right? Which you get from a lot of other brands that are 3 or 4 years of age. For us, it's about thinking about it in a modern fashion and calling that out. And part of that then is, well, if we are a modern Australian distillery, well, what does that mean exactly? And for us, it's about a new occasion and a modern serve. Right? So the occasion for whiskey that we want to really captivate and think we have a right to win at is the dinner table with food. Like, you think about whiskey matured in wine barrels. If those wine characteristics aren't doing their job properly, then we might as well shut the shutters now and sort of forget about it, because we feel like that whiskey at dinner is a thing. Now, doing that neat is tough. You could do it with dessert. You might be able to do it with a steak or some ribs. The best way to do it is to think of the whiskey as an ingredient in a great drink, and leave it to great bartenders and inspire people at home to kind of serve Starward as part of their meal in a great drink. And so those are the 3 ways that we've kind of innovated as a brand. I think it's in that context of, while the process, is a little different, it's disruptive. The way that we've scaled up, and our, the mindset that we can be a founder-led brand that isn't founder necessarily 100% owned. And the third aspect is that we've got, we're very passionate about serving whiskey on the drinker's terms as opposed to the maker's terms.
Yes. Where the thread I'd like to go down there is with ownership versus control. That's something that I learned about when listeners will know I started a tech company myself, and ended up failing after 2 years, but I learned that lesson through that. We had some private investment, and part of that process was learning about not necessarily splitting the pie, but making the pie bigger, and that we could still retain control, but we gave away some ownership in it. And that was something that it resonated with me, because that was something that I learned as well. On the capital raising point you made, how do you advise, not necessarily advise, we'll stay away from that word, but how do you recommend other entrepreneurs go about raising capital? Should they do it early like you guys did, or should they wait now? Or how do you see?
The fundamental is you always need more than you think you need, right? And you need it sooner than you think you'll need it, right? So that's kind of fundamentally any business, that's the case, right? We went through some white-knuckled moments where I was literally hanging on by the whites of my fingernails in this business. And the thing that got both the investors and me through that was a really clear vision of what we wanted to do. And not being belligerent about it, right? But by the same token, holding ourselves true to that vision. I would much prefer to have failed at achieving the vision than to have compromised on the vision for Starwood and done something that ultimately would not really fulfill a fire that's burning within me. You know, because ultimately it's people from the founder down that run entrepreneurial enterprises. And if they don't believe in what the vision is, if it's just about a paycheck, or if it's just about a milestone or an exit, it won't happen. It very rarely happens, right? There's got to be some, you know, you can be very lucky to do that. But I think the great businesses around the world have a really, you know, clarity of purpose and a vision that is almost beyond them, but gets them out of bed every morning and, you know, makes them want to kind of keep doing what they're doing. And so there's no accident we're called Starwood, right? Like, you know, we're kind of on that journey to reach for the stars. We want to, you know, as you've probably heard, you know, a whiskey in every self-respecting bar around the world. Like, I mean, that's audacious from a fledgling little operation in Port Melbourne where no one even knows that Australia makes whiskey, and I'm talking about it being in every bar around the world. But that's the ambition. That's the ambition, and I think that you need to find investors, you need to find people, whether they're investors or employees, that buy into that. Because once you're aligned around that vision, the rest of it will sort itself out.
I listened to a great podcast once. I think it was one of Ty Lopez's episodes with one of his guests. I can't recall the guest at the time, but he said that there are two things that you need to be successful. He said you need to know how to raise money, and you need to know how to hire people. And it's exactly what you've just, the comment you've made there.
It's the same skill set.
Exactly.
Like you're hiring people that can give you some money as
Totally.
opposed to hiring people that have some talent, right?
Yes.
So it's actually, the journey is the same, you know, at a fundamental level. The reason why you get good people on board is because you've got a great passion, a clearly articulated plan, a great product, and a route to market that makes sense, right? So that's great people will see that and want to be a part of that journey.
Yes.
Investors will see that and want to be a part of that journey. The problem typically is that one of those bits that we just talked about requires a leap of faith.
Yes.
You know, and the investor then and that's about pricing risk, isn't it? You know, like and percentage of equity and all that sort of stuff. But fundamentally, it's a recruitment exercise in both instances.
100%. That's exactly what I thought when I heard that, and so I'm so glad to hear that you say the same thing. That's really awesome. What innovations or innovative techniques or processes have you seen in the industry?
I mean, whiskey's been made pretty much the same way for hundreds of years, right? We just need to capture that vapor that forms from alcohol and then refine it and get all of the delicious stuff into a bottle. What we've observed, I guess, over the more recent years has been about process automation and being smarter about energy consumption. And, you know, so this is really at the process end, right? Focusing on better yield from your grains. But fundamentally, the production process hasn't changed. The thing that, you know, we're observing, and, you know, we're part of that in terms of the whole maturation environment. You know, there are lots of people that talk about a whiskey matured in days. Now, it's a spirit matured in days that tastes like a whiskey, right? It's not a whiskey because a whiskey needs to be matured in wood for 2 years. That's the law, right? Now, in different places, I mean, in the US, any contact with wood means that it's a whiskey. So a lot of people in the US are saying, well, I've got this whiskey, it's 6 months old, you should taste it. And that's been difficult for us in the States as we've started to scale up, because it's like, you know, I'm sure a lot of hospitality bar owners will know this kind of thinking. It's like, well, if I have one more Australian gin distiller come to my door and ask me if I, you know, the shelf is full, you know, they're all great, I love them, but which one am I taking off to put you on, right? And so there's a little bit of that going on in the United States, and some of it it's whiskey by definition, but it's not what we're selling that customer. But we're associated with that scene. So, you know, I think clarity in having definitions is important. I think maturations, there's huge opportunity there to kind of really rethink and reimagine what a whiskey is. You know, part of what we talk about is to challenge people's perceptions of what whiskey can be.
Yes.
And I'm all for it. You know, I think it sounds like, well, hold on a second, I'm investing so much time in waiting for a product. Why would I encourage people to do it sooner? It's a broad church. Let the consumer decide. That's always been my kind of attitude. And look, the other aspect is, you know, we've probably heard this before, but it's the brand with the best story that wins, right? The brand with the best story wins. It's not necessarily about quality and ingredients and process, because frankly, half the people that drink whiskey don't know how it's made. Right? So, you know, in that context, actually, you've got to captivate people and capture their hearts and minds, not tell them how it's made. That's kind of the boring end.
Yes. What changes do you want to see take place?
Yeah, I think so. The changes that we benefited from are the ones that I'd like to see more of, right? And fundamentally, it's been a shift in demographic. It's not just tweed jacket, pipe smoking Scotsmen and their kin by a fireplace drinking scotch. It's everyone. Everyone are drinking whiskey. You know, so and that's a huge opportunity for us that I don't think is going to slow down. And you know, we're obviously very long and very bullish on that kind of trend. The other one that's really interested us has been, and you know, it's still very early days, is the home occasion. I guess the dinner table at home as opposed to the dinner table at a restaurant, and people's appetite to make great tasting cocktails. So it's almost like the MasterChef phenomenon, but with booze. And we've seen it, and are serving that market now with something that's really convenient, very consistent, and talks all of the craft credentials that Starward has in the form of a bottled cocktail. And you know, between you and me, that was just born out of the fact that I'd go to dinner parties with a bottle of whiskey, and then end up being bartender for the night, making mixed drinks for everybody because I brought the whiskey along. So I was like, I've got to solve this problem, and I thought I might just make myself, I'll pre-batch the cocktails, and then people go, this is really good. It's like, I think I'm onto something here, and then started to realise that, you know, A, we're serving that occasion that I love. B, we're not diluting the brand because that's what we want people to do.
Yes.
And C, we've eliminated a lot of the risk in making a great cocktail by pre-batching it for them. So I think that we're going to see more cocktails at home. Ice is a big challenge to that for us, and B, we're really excited about continuing to launch bottled cocktails using our amazing whiskey as the base, and then creating crafting cocktails fit for purpose for home.
Bottled cocktails are a very smart business move, obviously, because for lack of a better term, it makes it palatable to the consumer.
Yeah.
It's a good foot in the door to introduce them to a brand as well.
100%. You know, and that comes back to our ethos of approachable, right? You know, we want to be an approachable whiskey. If we're going to get people, you know, and I have it all the time, you know what, I don't like whiskey, but I love this, whiskey cocktail you've made. It's like, well, then you kind of do like whiskey. You like it like this, you know. And so there's just this shift in perception of what, whiskey is viewed as something that's neat or with ice, or maybe with a splash of water. And we want to kind of move that dial quite substantially, being like, well, the same way you think about a gin, right? Like, how many people drink their gin neat, and there's no problems with that. So we want to do the same thing with whiskey.
Yes. So on thinking about innovation in the industry along the lines of the way we've just described, what do you think one of the next moves is going to be for whiskey producers in the world? You know, say we've gone into bottled cocktails. What's another way people are going to move?
Yeah, I don't know is the short answer. I think, bottled cocktails is a good example of the trend, though, which is serving the customer what they want, as opposed to telling them how they should drink the product, which is, I think, what's happened for a very long time particularly with whiskey.
Mm.
So that's the bigger trend, right? And for me, bottled cocktails is a good example. Is it e-cigarettes to vaping? You know, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, you needed to have the e-cigarette, which looked and felt like a cigarette, you know, almost to you know, physically, to then kind of step along a journey to something that's nothing like.
Yeah.
But it's a different, you know, same occasion done differently. So I don't know. I don't know where that's going to go, but I think that's where the trend's going. I think, you know, the other thing that we're keeping a close eye on is obviously this moderation movement and lower ABV drinks becoming more and more popular.
Mm-hmm.
Zero alcohol spirits, which is almost like an oxymoron, but it's not, right? Like, you can create a spirit that has no alcohol in it. It's distilled, right? You know, that trend is something that I think, you know, again, about consumption, moderation, temperance, you know, that we need to kind of keep an eye on. And I don't see it as a threat to the business. It's more about, well, what do we do to kind of capitalise on that as well?
Yes, that's right. It also, it could be a fantastic thing for Australia. Obviously, lower ABV drinks. Could people be drinking more of them as a result? And I mean, yes, obviously they will, particularly with our culture, but that's not actually such a bad thing as well, because it means they might fill up before bad things happen too. And I just want to ask a quick question around the Australian drinking culture. How do you see that affecting Starward, and do you think it's been helpful or a hindrance? Or
the overwhelming trend that we've seen is that people are drinking less but better. That's certainly the case in spirits. You know, the major brands that were in the, you know, with whiskies sub $40 price point are in decline, and whiskies that are in the $50 plus price point are in growth. There's a very good reason for that. I think we're all starting to realise that, you know what, we should kind of be a bit more respectful of our bodies and just drink better, you know, and so we've benefited from that, no doubt about that.
David, I'd love to ask you about your creative process. You're obviously a very creative mind. I'd love to know, this is a massive question, so please take which part you'd like to run with it. Firstly, it's getting into a creative mindset. And a lot of people can't really articulate how they get into that mindset. You might be familiar with the way you get into it. Then it's around building that idea and playing with those concepts and then executing on it. A lot of people can explain the execution. Obviously, we've talked a lot about that execution. You do it a lot through whiskey. There might be other areas that you like to explore that creativity of your own, and you have in the past. How do you get into that creative mindset before you play with an idea?
Yeah, it's iterative is probably the first thing. So typically I'll start with, like, it's either you start with a block of marble and you chisel away at it to create a masterpiece, or you start off with something very small and it snowballs, right? There's two ways that you can kind of, you know, I think fundamentally approach the creative exercise. And for me, it's far more of like having an idea and refining it, more of that snowball analogy than it is chiseling away.
Yes.
You know, so I don't know, yeah, and that's probably the approach to my creative process in terms of like an idea. I also like to take them for walks, so I talk to people a lot about that at each phase of that snowball, you know, like the next iteration, and just get feedback and sense check things. I'm also, I think, really fortunate to have time to think, and that's often a real luxury for people. Whether it's, you know, cycling into work every day for 30 minutes in, 30 minutes out, there's an hour, no phone, no screen, no headphones even, just to think. You know, and I know that Jack Dorsey does that. Like, you know, he kind of walks to work, you know, and I can completely relate. You know, not that we're anywhere near the scale of Twitter or Square, but you know, he's running to very big companies. And I think the reason why he can kind of go down that path is because he allows him some space to think. And so I think that's the best ideas often have a lot of space around them, in terms of thinking time. And I know from my perspective that, that creative process needs that time. And, it's not easy, but I try and give myself that time.
What I've noticed is that a lot of people, when they're thinking about, they're like, how do I be creative, and that some people seem to be inherently creative, but I think it's a gear that people just switch into to think creatively.
And it's also left mind, right mind stuff, right? So I think that we kind of live in, I'm going to get this wrong, the left, right? The analytical, process oriented.
I think that's right.
Yeah. But that hemisphere.
But it's like
you might need to kind of dump me over, right? So
you just hear me go left.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but I'm pretty sure that the right brain is the creative space, and you need to kind of cross that bridge into that environment and find your way in. Right? We all have it.
Yes.
We all have a left and a right brain. Very few of us don't. And so it's just a matter of activating it and crossing that bridge. It's an amazing TED talk about somebody that actually had a stroke and then kind of activated their, they're a neuroscientist, so very, very much in the left brain world. But as part of that recovery process, activated their right brain.
Amazing.
Became far more creative and relaxed and at peace with the world, and a whole, it's almost like a psychedelic drug addict,
Yeah, just
turned on, right? But it was just almost like left switched off, right switched on, and over time it kind of flipped back. But it's amazing TED talk about. I don't know the author, but I might get it to you.
That'd be fantastic.
Because it is quite a fascinating thing, and it proves that we can all be creative and we can all go down that kind of path. It just needs practice, like most things.
The way that I've found is through this. I summarize it as infinity, and I try to think about the infinite. The creative way of thinking is an infinite way of thinking. That's how I describe it, is trying to think as big as possible. And another word I use is macro. And what I try to do through this show, really on a bigger picture, is help get people thinking in a creative gear. Because that's really what I'm passionate about. On a fundamental level, underlying everything is around creativity and innovation. Expressing our ideas in whatever medium we love. That's really what drives me, and motivating and inspiring people to help them express those ideas. So whether it's in hospitality or you're a painter or whatever it is you love, or you're an engineer, it doesn't matter. It's around expressing those ideas, and what underlies all those things is this creative thought process and the what I call the infinite way of thinking. So I guess that's how I would describe it to people. But what is it that you do to step into that creative mode?
I think it's probably the other way around for me, in that I have to step into a more structured and less abstract mindset.
Yeah.
That's my default. The long game, very abstract ideas, and it's actually the opposite. So it's just almost, rather than having to cross the bridge left to right, I'm crossing it right to left.
I guess it's so then thinking about that medium and thinking about the medium and a way to express your ideas through that medium. What's so fantastic about this industry is that it's the only one that we can engage all five senses in expressing. So when the receiver of that art is someone who engages themselves through all five senses. I think that's what's most incredible about it.
Yeah, and I think, and so, just following on from that, I totally agree. And, one of the things that we often talk about, particularly in our master classes and tours, is how actually whiskey tasting and whiskey drinking are two different things. And the tasting is actually quite a mindful activity, because it is a sensory experience. It almost takes that drinker into that realm we were talking about, of just being abstract. Let's not kind of try and be too analytical, and just be.
Yes. Yes.
Sit with the feelings,
Yes.
senses that you're getting.
It's being present in the activity.
Correct.
I love that. I love that we can do that so easily in this industry. It's just to be aware of exactly what's happening when you're drinking or eating or smelling something. It's an immersive industry. And
Yeah.
that's what I love about it.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away with that, I would love to ask you what your biggest challenge is right now.
The biggest challenge we face, I think, as a brand and the business is that at the moment we don't have another distillery at the scale that we're at that can kind of, with a unified front, take on the world. And so it just makes that exercise a little bit more difficult because it's just us. My wish is, perversely, that we had some competition, that would keep us very sharp and on our toes, which is always very good, but B, grow the category together.
My very last question for you, David, is what's next for David Vitale?
Very few people from Australia get to build a brand or a business in the United States, and even fewer people around the world get to build a booze business in the United States, right? Like build to scale. So for me, that's the journey that we're on, and I'm so excited by it because it's just as we discussed earlier, I'm a passionate student of the American culture and way of life, and secondly, I think if we want to be successful around the world, that it's mandatory that the whiskey is successful in the United States. So that's the big mountain we're going to climb.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for being on the show today, David. It's been great having you on.
Cheers.
Stay in touch with the show after hours at Hospopreneurs on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Creativity and innovation in hospitality. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson. Sound like tomorrow. Sweet as sound. What does tomorrow sound like? Let's show you.